You know, sometimes you wake up and realize the life you've built was never really yours. It's like walking through a house you thought you owned, only to find out your name was never even on the deed. My name's Curtis. Not the kind of guy who draws attention in a crowd, more like the one holding the door open for everyone else. I always believed marriage was about partnership, about lifting each other up. Guess I was wrong. At least, when it came to Marlene. Marlene had this way of talking about herself like she was some rare trophy. She used to laugh with her friends over wine nights, saying things like, "Curtis is lucky I even looked twice." At first, I laughed along. It was easier than admitting that somewhere deep inside, it stung more than I wanted to admit. Our 10th anniversary had just passed. I thought we were solid. Turns out, I was just the guy holding the frame around a picture she thought she could upgrade any time she wanted. It wasn't one big betrayal that woke me up. It was 1,000 tiny cracks, each one whispered behind closed doors, posted in hidden text messages, and left lingering in the way she smiled a little too brightly when other men were around. The worst part? I let it happen. I told myself she was just confident, just proud. I convinced myself that good marriages had jokes like that. I made excuses for the coldness, the disrespect, the way she brushed me off at parties like an afterthought. I didn't want to be the insecure husband. I wanted to be the trusting one, the understanding one. But then came the night when it all fell apart, when Marlene didn't just call herself the prize. She proved she thought I was nothing but a consolation prize. And for once, I didn't beg. I didn't argue. I simply let her realize what it felt like when the trophy shelf was suddenly empty. The shift began so subtly that at first, I doubted whether I was even imagining it. Marlene started staying out later, at first for networking events, then for girls' nights, and eventually for nights she didn't even bother labeling anymore. Every time I asked if she wanted to have dinner together or maybe just spend a quiet evening at home, she'd flash that tight smile, the one that never reached her eyes, and tell me I was clingy. I'll never forget one particular Saturday. I had made reservations at her favorite restaurant, something we hadn't done in months. She accepted the invite with a casual shrug, barely looking up from her phone. That night, she showed up an hour late, reeking of a brand new perfume I didn't recognize, laughing about how plans change, and I should learn to adapt. I sat there across from her, my stomach sinking with every forced chuckle and every dismissive glance she gave. That's when it hit me like a freight train. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was her background noise. I was the dusty trophy on a shelf she no longer cared to polish, let alone cherish. Still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. I told myself maybe she was stressed, maybe she needed space. I swallowed my pride, made excuses for her behavior, and waited for the woman I married to come back to me. Then, one evening, after another one of her mysterious nights out, I found her phone buzzing endlessly on the counter. She was in the shower. I glanced at the screen without meaning to, and there it was. A message from a guy saved as Mark Work Event that read, "Last night was insane. You were something else." My chest tightened. My hands shook. I didn't touch the phone again. I didn't storm into the bathroom screaming. I just sat there on the couch, listening to the water running, realizing the depth of my own stupidity. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Because in her mind, she didn't have to. She believed she had me locked in, that no matter how she treated me, I would cling to her like a lost puppy. After all, wasn't she the prize? The one worth fighting for? That night, something broke inside me. Not in an explosive, movie scene kind of way. Quietly. Deeply. Permanently. I realized the saddest truth of all. Marlene had stopped valuing me a long time ago. And the only reason she kept me around was because I still acted like she was worth winning. But what if? What if I stopped playing the game? The next morning, something inside me had changed, but you wouldn't have seen it on the surface. I still made coffee for both of us. I still asked if she needed anything before she headed out for another work lunch. But beneath the calm, I had decided I was done chasing a woman who didn't want to be caught. If Marlene wanted to believe she was the prize, I would let her, but I wasn't going to be the contestant anymore. No arguments. No pleas. Just quiet, deliberate distance. At first, she didn't notice. She breezed through her routines, tossing off distracted kisses that barely brushed my cheek, treating my silence as acceptance. But a few days in, the cracks began to show. She noticed when I stopped initiating conversations. She noticed when I didn't ask about her day. She noticed when, instead of planning elaborate date nights, I spent my evenings at the gym, working out harder than I had in years, or buried in books she never knew I owned. Then came the weekend when her friend Madison invited us both to a house party. Normally, I would have made excuses to skip. Marlene loved showing off, parading me around like a loyal accessory. This time, I agreed without hesitation. I even smiled when I did it. That Saturday, I dressed in a way I hadn't bothered with in years, fitted jeans, a sharp button-down, even a new watch. When Marlene saw me, her brows lifted slightly, as if seeing me with new eyes. But she didn't say anything. She just grabbed her purse and marched out to the car. At the party, things took a strange turn. People I barely knew, women I had only spoken to politely at previous events, suddenly started conversations with me. I wasn't trying to flirt. I wasn't trying to make a scene. But somehow, without me lifting a finger, attention drifted toward me. I laughed when it felt right, smiled when someone made a clever joke, and kept my drink steady in my hand. For the first time in a long time, I felt like more than just Marlene's plus one. And Marlene? She hated it. I caught her glaring from across the room, her jaw tight, her posture rigid. At one point, she stormed over and interrupted a harmless conversation I was having with two of her friends, practically dragging me away under the excuse that someone needed help with the drinks. It was laughably transparent. For years, she had been so sure of her place, the adored wife, the untouchable prize. But now, as I calmly moved through the crowd without clinging to her, it was like the ground under her feet shifted. She wasn't used to competing. She wasn't used to fighting for attention. She wasn't used to me not chasing her. And deep down, I realized something both liberating and devastating. Marlene had never truly loved me for who I was. She loved the way I made her feel about herself. And now that I had stepped back, she was feeling something she couldn't tolerate. Irrelevant. After the party, the tension between us was almost suffocating. The drive home was silent, apart from the hum of the engine and the occasional sharp breath from Marlene. She kept glancing over at me, as if waiting for me to ask what was wrong, to soothe her bruised ego like I always had before. But I didn't. I focused on the road, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind oddly calm. When we got home, she slammed the door harder than necessary and disappeared into the bedroom without a word. I didn't follow. Instead, I sat in the living room, letting the silence settle around me like a new kind of peace. It was strange how quickly I adapted to it. For so long, I thought I needed her validation to feel whole. Now, I realized how heavy that need had been, and how freeing it was to finally set it down. The next week, the shift between us became undeniable. Marlene started dressing up more, putting on makeup even when she wasn't leaving the house. She laughed louder at my jokes, asked me more questions about my day, even suggested we book a vacation, something she hadn't cared about in years. But it wasn't genuine. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't reconnecting with me because she missed me. She was panicking because, for the first time, she felt the ground slipping out from under her. And then came the message. I was sitting at the kitchen table early one morning when her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a name I didn't recognize, Devin. Curiosity prickled at the edges of my mind, but I stayed where I was. I didn't need to read the message. I didn't need to invade her privacy. I already knew what it would say. Marlene had been searching for attention elsewhere for months, maybe longer. It wasn't just about feeling admired. It was about being worshipped. And when I stepped back, when I stopped giving her the blind devotion she craved, she simply went looking for it somewhere else. Later that day, she tried to sit close to me on the couch, her body leaning into mine, her voice soft and playful like it used to be. "You've been quiet lately," she said, tracing circles on my arm. "Is everything okay between us?" I turned to look at her, really look at her, the carefully curled hair, the flawless makeup, the designer sweater she wore just to sit at home. A few months ago, I would have melted under that kind of attention. I would have grabbed her hand, kissed her forehead, and whispered reassurances. But not now. I smiled politely and said, "Everything's fine, Marlene." She blinked, confused by my neutrality. Because in her mind, fine wasn't good enough. She wanted obsession. She wanted desperation. She wanted me to fight for her like I had when I still believed she was something precious. But I was done fighting for someone who treated love like a prize to be won rather than a partnership to be cherished. And deep down, Marlene knew it too. The competition had started. And for the first time in her life, she was losing. The cracks between us widened faster than I expected. Marlene became restless, edgy. She started planning random date nights, insisting we needed us time again. She even bought tickets to a concert she knew I wouldn't enjoy, something flashy, loud, completely disconnected from who I was. It wasn't about me. It was about her reclaiming control, about recentering the spotlight on herself. I went along with it, calmly, politely. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for her affection. I just existed. And it drove her insane. The night of the concert, she wore a dress she hadn't touched in years, tight, bold, the kind that once would have knocked the air out of my lungs. Now, I saw it for what it was, armor. She wasn't dressing for me. She was dressing for the attention of strangers, for the validation she feared losing. At the event, I stayed by her side, polite but distant. I didn't hover. I didn't compliment her every 2 minutes. I talked with a few people. I laughed when it felt natural. And slowly but surely, the energy shifted again. Other women noticed me, not in a predatory way, but in that curious, intrigued glance kind of way. Marlene noticed too. Her hand clutched my arm tighter than necessary. She leaned in too close, smiled too hard. When we got home, she exploded. "You've changed," she snapped, her voice trembling. "You don't even look at me anymore. You don't care." I stood there, calmly hanging up my jacket, feeling an odd sense of finality settle over me. "I haven't changed," I said evenly. "I just stopped chasing what doesn't want to be caught." Marlene's face twisted, caught between outrage and fear. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time, she didn't have a quick comeback. There was no witty jab, no dismissive laugh. Just silence. A silence that weighed heavier than any scream could have. The next few days were a blur of awkward small talk and icy distance. Marlene hovered around me constantly, trying to find cracks in the wall I had built around myself. She cooked elaborate meals, left sticky notes with little hearts on the fridge, complimented my outfits, all the things she hadn't bothered doing in years. It was a performance, and a bad one at that. I could see right through it, but I let her act it out. Because deep down, I realized something even more painful than her betrayal. Marlene wasn't trying to win me back because she loved me. She was trying to win because she couldn't stand losing. There's a difference. A devastating difference. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. I think the hardest part wasn't watching her try. It was realizing how hollow her efforts were. They weren't built on love or regret. They were built on fear of losing the pedestal she had comfortably perched herself on for years. Watching her scramble was like watching a drowning swimmer thrash around, not because they were desperate for the shore, but because they couldn't stand the idea of sinking. One evening, after another strained dinner where we barely spoke, Marlene finally cracked. She waited until I was half asleep on the couch, then sat down next to me and started crying. Big, messy, gasping sobs that shook her whole frame. "I feel like I'm losing you," she choked out. "Why won't you fight for us? Why won't you try like you used to?" I sat up slowly, looking at the woman I had once loved with every fiber of my being. The woman who had once been my world. I remembered the late nights we used to spend talking about dreams and fears. I remembered how she used to laugh with her whole body, how her smile once felt like home. And yet, sitting there now, watching her desperate performance, all I felt was an empty ache. "I fought," I said quietly. "I fought every day. I fought for years. You just never noticed because you thought you'd already won." Her face crumpled further, but I didn't rush to comfort her. For once, I let the truth hang there between us, raw and ugly. She needed to feel it. She needed to know what it was like to be invisible, the way I had felt for far too long. The next few weeks were a blur of silent standoffs and half-hearted reconciliations. Marlene tried everything, planning weekend trips, spontaneous date nights, even hinting about renewing our vows. But nothing could patch the broken foundation we stood on. Trust, once cracked, doesn't heal with band-aids. It shatters, and no amount of polished appearances can rebuild it. Meanwhile, I changed quietly behind the scenes. I started spending more time outside the house, hitting the gym, joining new social groups, reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during our marriage. For years, my life had revolved around Marlene's orbit. Now, I was building a new world where I was no longer a satellite spinning endlessly around someone else's sun. And the more I built myself back up, the more Marlene unraveled. She couldn't stand not being the center of my universe anymore. She couldn't stand the fact that my world was expanding. And she wasn't the axis it spun around. The irony was almost cruel. The woman who once flaunted herself as a prize was now desperately clinging to the man she had spent years belittling. And the saddest part? Even as she reached for me, she never once truly apologized. Not for the late nights. Not for the disrespect. Not for the thousand small ways she had made me feel small. Because to Marlene, admitting she was wrong would mean admitting she wasn't the prize she always believed herself to be. And that was a truth she would rather choke on than say out loud. The final unraveling came faster than even I expected. It was a Saturday night, One of those evenings that should have been ordinary but somehow ended up defining everything. Marlene had suggested we host a small gathering, just a few friends, some wine, easy laughter. I agreed, casually, without much thought. But deep inside, I already knew what would happen. She spent the whole day preparing, more frantic than usual. She made sure the house looked perfect, wore a new dress that hugged her figure in all the right ways, and laid out enough food to feed twice the number of guests invited. When the doorbell finally rang, she greeted everyone with that dazzling smile she reserved for audiences not for me. The night began harmlessly enough. Small talk, laughter, clinking glasses. But it didn't take long for old patterns to resurface. Marlene, ever the star of her own show, gravitated toward the men in the group, subtly soaking up their admiration while keeping me safely on the sidelines. It was how she always operated, except this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't standing there, waiting for crumbs of attention. I wasn't the shadow at the edge of her spotlight. I was engaged in my own conversations, connecting with people in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. I saw the confused glances Marlene shot me from across the room, the way her smile faltered when she realized I was no longer orbiting around her. The real breaking point came later that evening. One of my friends, an old college buddy named James, pulled me aside. "Man," he said quietly, glancing toward Marlene, "I don't mean to overstep, but you deserve better. Always have." I blinked at him, caught completely off guard. He shrugged, offering a sad smile. "Everyone sees it. Maybe it's time you see it too." That simple comment hit harder than any argument or betrayal ever could. Because deep down, I already knew he was right. Everyone had seen it, the imbalance, the contempt, the slow erosion of who I was. I had just been too blinded by loyalty, by love, by hope, to admit it to myself. After the guests left and the house fell into silence, Marlene turned to me, sensing the shift but not understanding it. "You've been so cold lately," she said, her voice shaking. "What happened to us?" I looked at her for a long moment, really looked past the makeup, past the pretty dress, past the desperation she tried to mask as confidence. "You happened," I said simply. "And I let it happen. But not anymore." Her face twisted in anger, confusion, grief, a chaotic blend of emotions she didn't know how to contain. "You're just going to throw everything away," she spat. I shook my head, feeling oddly calm. "You already did. You just didn't notice." That night, I packed a small bag. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I needed to finally choose myself. As I walked out the door, Marlene stood frozen in the entryway, too stunned to speak. For once, there were no accusations, no insults, no manipulative pleas. Only silence. And it was in that silence that I realized something she never had. Love isn't about winning. It's about valuing. And if you have to compete for someone's basic respect, you've already lost more than you know. In the weeks after I left, there was a strange kind of peace that settled over me, not the blaring, triumphant kind you see in movies, but something quieter, deeper, more honest. I stayed at a small apartment at first, one that overlooked a park with a worn-out basketball court and a coffee shop that always smelled like burned espresso. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't living under someone else's expectations. Marlene tried to reach out, of course. First with angry texts, then tearful voicemails, and finally letters that swung wildly between apologies and accusations. But I didn't respond. Not because I hated her. I didn't. I pitied her, maybe. But I had finally learned that some things, like self-respect, peace of mind, and genuine love, aren't things you can beg for. They either exist naturally, or they don't exist at all. With time, my days started to feel full again. I reconnected with old friends, the ones Marlene had subtly discouraged me from seeing. I found new hobbies, hiking trails outside the city, taking a woodworking class just for the hell of it, even volunteering at a local shelter on weekends. Little by little, I built a life that wasn't about proving my worth to someone else. It was about living it for myself. One afternoon, a few months later, I sat in that same coffee shop with a book in my hand and a real smile on my face. A woman at the next table, kind eyes, easy laugh, caught my attention. We talked. It was simple, unforced. No games. No performances. Just two people sharing a moment without trying to outshine each other. I realized then that real love doesn't make you feel like you have to fight for air. It doesn't demand worship or sacrifice of your dignity. It simply fits. It supports. It grows. Marlene wasn't the prize. And honestly, neither was I. Because love isn't about winning someone like a trophy. It's about choosing each other every day with kindness and respect. I'm not angry anymore. I don't wish her harm. I just wish she finds whatever it is she's really been chasing all these years. As for me, I finally stopped chasing. And it turns out, the view standing still is pretty incredible.